Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Back with us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be talking about summer ventilation of calf hutches. For those of you that are joining us here online, we thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to post those there in the chat area to the right of your screen. If you're joining us from social media, you can simply post those questions directly in the channel as well. So, Dr. Kertz, great to see you again. Thank you for being here.
I'm glad the weather cooperated and I'm here today.
Right? We've got storms coming through the Midwest too. So,
Yeah.
so talk to us. You mentioned weather. Talk to us about summer and the hot temperatures and what you need to take care of when it comes to your calf hutches, what you need to be aware of.
Well, the first thing is the term called the zone of thermal neutrality, and that is the temperature range within which an animal does not have to expend energy to either warm up because it's cold or to cool down when it's hot. And for the calves, there's a little bit of a difference in what it is. In terms of Fahrenheit, the old NRC said 59 degrees to 77, which is equivalent to 15 to 25 in centigrade. The new NASEM increased the upper limit of 79, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So that's generally what's termed the zone of thermal neutrality. But that is impacted by other factors such as the age of a calf, how much hair coat it has, wind speed, and the amount of body fat. Young calves, when they're born, only have about 3 to 5% fat and have the greatest surface area to body mass that a dairy animal will have. So those are other factors that can affect how well the calves adjust within that temperature range or outside that range. Now, another factor is when a calf is born, it's not a functional rumen. So as the rumen begins to develop and function, it creates a heat of fermentation. And that is a benefit to ruminants during the wintertime, but it's also the bane or the problem of ruminants during the summer. That's why ruminants don't handle summer as well. And of course, what typically happens if they want to reduce the heat of rumen fermentation is they eat less. And so you have less performance. So there have been a couple studies in the last few years at Florida and more recently now at the University of Wisconsin that have looked at temperature environmental effects on calves and hutches. And that's good because there's virtually no data available in this area. So in this particular study we're going to look at, it was done at the University of Wisconsin dairy facility at Arlington, which is near Madison. And it was a 3x3 Latin square, which was replicated 4 times. So there were 12 female Holstein calves that had a 4-day treatment exposure. And then there was a 3-day resting period, and that was the weekend. So I guess they got the weekend off. And of course, then the people who take care of them had the weekends off too. But on Monday of each week, then they were put on to the next treatment and monitored and measured for that 4-day period. The calves themselves weighed when they started out about 85 pounds. That's a pretty good size for a female calf, a Holstein calf. And they were fed 4 quarts of colostrum initially, and thereafter 8 liters of milk replacer twice a day at 4 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. The starter was available in the water, and since these were hutches, the starter was inside the hutch and the water was outside. And that's a good key point because you don't want the starter to get wet if it rains, and you don't want the buckets to be side by side because if they are, then it's guaranteed the calves are going to drop water in the starter and starter in the water, and reduces the intake of both of those. So that's a good arrangement to have, is this degree of separation. And then these particular hutches were set up so that you could open the back, the upper back, and ventilate it, or you could keep it closed into varying degrees. Now, the calves that were on the study were at about 20 days of age when they began the study, and no later than weaning. So they tried to do it that way because waiting until about 21 days, you miss the period when most of the uh, scours occurs and health issues occur, and so you'll have a more standardized period of time. So that's what they were doing, why they were doing it that way. Then they, of course, they had outside exercise area. So you had an inside temperature and you had an outside temperature. And then you had 3 treatments of ventilation. So if we look at the first figure now, we could see how they configured this. You can see the back of the hutches in that section A, and in one of the hutches, the back is completely closed, so there's no ventilation. In another hutch, the back is completely open, so it's maximum ventilation, what's called passive ventilation. And then in the other treatment, there was a wind speed created. There were solar cells, as you see in B, that created electricity to run a fan that ran a tubing into the hutch. So that's what was called active ventilation. And if you look at C, you can see that they could handle 12 calves at a time. Each had 3 treatments. And so that's how they replicated. Now, if you look at D, you can see what the average temperature and humidity was and what's called the temperature humidity index. That's sometimes called the wind chill factor too. So you can see that the upper one line and the variation, the upper line was above 60 to 80. And as we'll talk about, the temperature humidity index is about 70 for calves. So as it gets above that, combination temperature and humidity creates heat stress. So it's not only the temperature, but it's also the humidity. So now if we look at the some of the key results and the bullet points, let's kind of walk through those. The average daily temperature ranged from about 68 Fahrenheit to 80. And it was, let's see, during the study, average of 74 degrees, relative humidity of 73%. That's not unusual in Wisconsin during the summertime. And the THI, temperature humidity index, of 71. So the average of that was just a little bit above 70. So even in summertime, in the northern climates in the U.S., you're going to have some heat stress, which we know from cows, and we've paid more attention to that during the summertime now. But the same is also true of calves. Now, the daily minimum temperature range from about 63.5 and all the way up to about, let's see, 84. The low temperature was between about 4 and 5 in the morning, and the high temperature was about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So you can see that 84 degrees during the afternoon would be certainly heat stress for these calves. The average hut temperature difference between the inside and the outside was about 3.2 degrees for the control. Now remember, the control is the back was completely closed. So there's no passive ventilation, no ventilation at all, except from the very front. So there's not much there. So when they were non-ventilated, they had the greatest difference between the inside and outside temperature. And when there was some passive ventilation, there wasn't much difference, a half a degree difference. And the active ventilation, there was 2 degrees. So it's almost like there was a little bit more difference between the inside and the outside temperature when they had the wind speed with that tubing. Now, interior airspeed was greater, of course, for the active ventilation because you had wind being blown through a tube. The calves and hutches had a significant decrease in respiratory rate per minute, and that's the simplest measurement to make for calves. You see, they were about 13 less respirations per minute for the active ventilation versus the control, and not that much difference from the passive ventilation. Rectal temperatures didn't vary that much, but it was greater for the active and then the passive and then the control. Now, despite the fact that there's elevated temperatures in the hutch with the air quality, it's not always that case, because if we look at the next point, the active ventilation only affected internal hutch temperatures relative to the control, but not to the passive ventilation. And that was primarily in the mid-morning hours. So calves that had the active ventilation spent less of their time inside their hutch than did the passive ventilation. Now that's, I think, a key observation, because why would that happen? You would think if you're blowing in air into the hutch that the calves would like to be in that air rather than outside where it may be warmer than inside. So I think the reason why is it could be two things. One is it was mentioned that this was a noisy apparatus. And someplace I read recently that calves don't like noise. I'm not sure cows do either. There's a question about whether they like music or not and what kind of music they like, but I won't go there. Um, but the calves evidently might have been affected by the noise, and that might be one reason they went outside, spent more time outside than inside with that ventilation. The other thing is it depends on the speed of the ventilation. I was once on a very good dairy farm in another country in Asia, and um, they had tunnel ventilation. That's sometimes used with cows and freestall units. You have a long, narrow barn, and at one end you have a mass of fans. The other end you have louvers. So the louvers are open, the fans are on. It pulls air through the entire building, and of course you can adjust the rate at which the air goes by the speed of the fans. On this particular farm, they had calves on elevated stalls. There were metal stalls. They were open flooring, no bedding, and they had a tunnel ventilation in it. Well, it was almost too much. I mean, if you stood there, your hair's flying and everything's flying. Of course, there's no flies there because it blows them through. And I told them because they were concerned that the calves weren't doing as well as they thought. I told them I thought the problem was they had too much ventilation. It was too high a speed. If they cut that back, they would probably do better. And of course, I don't know what happened if they actually did that. But that can be why there was this difference in the active ventilation in this case. And calves may not have liked the noise, and maybe they didn't even like the wind speed that was going on, so they spent more time outside. So this is a good experiment to run, but of course it would not be practical to put such a ventilation system into calf hutches because of the cost involved. Now, there's been a few other studies done with hutches, and actually at this place in the wintertime, we've covered that. And then there's been some studies in Texas in which they try to put shade cloth on top of the hutches, but the labor involved and the cost, having to do it twice a year, take it down, put it back up, made it impractical. And one of the simplest things I've seen uh, for calf hutches in the summertime is to prop up the back with like a cement block. There was a study done in Washington State by Dale Moore, in which she showed that had a beneficial effect measuring restoration rate. And the reason why is you get a uh, kind of a chimney effect. So if you got the back propped up at the bottom, the air comes in there and flows out the back of the top if it's open. So it's a chimney effect, sort of like we have with pre-salt barns with calves. So in this case, there was really no benefit to having the active ventilation, but it was beneficial to have the back open as much as possible to have the passive ventilation.
So some ventilation, something that kind of just keeps it cooled down a little bit for those calves is what you're saying.
Yeah, and of course, ideally, you'd have more of a shade, and that can vary by the hutch as to what that effect that has. But it's not practical generally to put shade over hutches to make it even cooler inside. But of course, the other thing is too that calves may like to get up and out and around some, and so it's helpful to have a little bit of an exercise area as well.
Do you know what the difference in the temperature is inside the hutch when you have shade versus when you don't have shade, when it might be out in the open sun?
There's one study a long time ago, I think it was done in Michigan, that looked at that, and there was quite a difference, but it was also a type of hutch they don't make anymore. I don't think it was a round hutch. And and then you had just a little simple, maybe a 6-inch ventilation on top. And I think the problem was that created the maximum inside temperature because there was so little ventilation and a lot of surface area. So I think you also have to look at the configuration of the hutches and how much ventilation they have, how much you can open them up.
That makes sense. A reminder that if you have any questions, to post those there for Dr. Kertz. Also, Dr. Kertz's column on this topic will appear in the May edition of Feedstuffs, our digital edition, and you can find it online. We have shared a link there for you as well to check out. So, Dr. Kertz, what would you say then is the bottom line in all of this? What should dairy producers think about when it comes to their hutches?
I think in the summertime, what they need to do is, first of all, use sand for bedding. It's the best. It doesn't have any organic material in. You're not going to get bugs and critters growing in it as you would if you had sawdust or shaving. And sand is cooler, and it stays dry unless you have a brain problem or surface area issue. And then the other thing is with your hutches, maximize the ventilation, open up as much as possible, and that will help minimize the temperature differential between outside and inside, and create as much coolness as you can. As we said, it's not practical generally to put shade over the hutches, but if you can do that with like some of that military camp canopy, that's probably the simplest thing to do.
Very good. Thank you so much for your insight here today and for taking the time to join us. We appreciate that.
All right, good. See you next time.
All right. Likewise, we appreciate all of you for tuning in. We know you have busy schedules, so giving us a little piece of your day is very appreciated. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format, so just go to feedstuffs.com and you can find the Feedstuffs 365 section there. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.